Right now, as you watch this, BlackBerry software is running inside 275 million vehicles. That is more than the total number of iPhones sold globally in the past 3 years combined. The operating system inside your car. Inside hospital, robotic surgery equipment, inside military aircraft used by NATO. The invisible operating system behind it all is BlackBerry, the same BlackBerry that the world buried, the same company whose stock fell 97% in 4 years, the same executives who stood in front of investors and lied again. Here is what almost nobody knows. In 2019, BlackBerry paid $1.4 billion in cash to acquire an AI cybersecurity company called Cylance. They told investors it was the future, the cornerstone of a new empire, the weapon that would destroy CrowdStrike. 6 years later, they sold that same company for $160 million. Strategy Lens produces one thing: documentary investigations into the corporate empires that shape the world economy. No opinions, no hot takes. The documented facts that the financial press glosses over, sourced from SEC complaints, court filings, and earnings reports that most people do not have the time to read. If you operate in business, investing, or any industry where knowing how power actually works is a competitive advantage, you cannot afford to miss what we cover. Subscribe now. We will be here when the next empire cracks. Back to BlackBerry, because where this story starts is not where most people think it does. Most people think BlackBerry began as a phone company. It did not. Research in Motion was founded in 1984 by Mike Lazaridis, a 23-year-old electrical engineering student at the University of Waterloo, and his business partner, Doug Fregin. Lazaridis was not building consumer devices. He was building industrial wireless data terminals, the kind that sit on factory floors and read barcodes. The first significant contract RIM won was not with a phone carrier. It was with General Motors. They built a wireless system for GM's automated factory floor. That was the DNA. Not consumer entertainment, not touchscreens, not apps. Industrial reliability, military grade precision, and data transmission in hostile environments. Hold that thought, because that engineering philosophy, prioritizing reliability over consumer experience, is going to explain everything that happens next. In 1996, Jim Balsillie joined as co-CEO, and this is where the company's dual personality was born. Lazaridis was the engineer obsessed with precision. Balsillie was the salesman obsessed with penetration. What they built together between 1996 and 2001 was not just a phone. It was a three-part system that the business world had never seen before. Part 1. The physical keyboard. 4 decades later, people still argue about this. But in 1999, when the alternative was a stylus and a screen, being able to type 40 words per minute on a handheld device was not a feature. It was a revolution. BlackBerry became a productivity category before the iPhone turned that category into entertainment. Part 2. The BlackBerry Enterprise Server, BES. This is the piece that almost no one outside the corporate IT world ever understood. BES sat inside a company's own firewall. It did not route email through some outside server. It compressed, encrypted, and relayed corporate data through BlackBerry's own network operation centers and directly to the device. The IT department maintained total control. Corporate data never touched a public server it did not already own. For a bank, for a law firm, for a government intelligence agency, that was worth any price. Part 3. Push email. Every competitor at the time made users manually check for new messages. BlackBerry delivered email to the device in real time, the same way a pager delivers a page. The moment an email arrived on the server, it was in your hand. The blinking red light became the most psychologically powerful notification in the history of corporate technology. Journalists started calling users crackberry addicts, and rather than treating that as a warning, RIM's PR team turned it into a brand identity. By 2000, RIM had something more valuable than market share. It had political dependency. The United States government had standardized on BlackBerry. The Department of Defense, the National Security Agency, the White House. When Barack Obama was elected in 2008 and famously refused to give up his BlackBerry to the Secret Service, the image that produced a sitting president literally fighting for his crackberry was the most expensive piece of advertising in corporate history. And it cost RIM exactly nothing. The US government was not just a client, it was a hostage. By 2005, when RIM was fighting the NTP patent lawsuit and a federal judge threatened to shut down the entire BlackBerry network in America, the US Department of Justice personally intervened. They asked the judge not to issue the injunction, not because they cared about RIM, because shutting down BlackBerry would have disrupted military communications. A Canadian technology startup had made itself so essential to American national security that the US military was functionally their defense attorney. By 2008, RIM stock was trading at $150 a share. The company was worth $83 billion, Canada's most valuable public company, and the co-CEOs had just started doing something they believed no one would ever notice. They were rewriting history, specifically the dates on their own stock options, and there was already an email trail proving they knew exactly what they were doing. By the mid-2000s, Research in Motion was not just a phone company, it was the backbone of global executive communication. Here is the first detail most people have never heard. RIM's guerrilla marketing strategy in the late 1990s targeted business travelers in airport lounges and first-class cabins specifically. They deployed teams of RIM employees to approach executives who were visibly struggling with laptops, offer them a free 30-day trial of a BlackBerry, and quietly collect the devices at the end of the trial. Return rate under 5%. The laptop and plane demographic was so immediately addicted that almost none of them gave it back. Word of mouth among C-suite executives spread faster than any advertising budget could have manufactured. Second detail, BlackBerry Messenger was in 2006 and 2007 functionally the world's first truly global private messaging platform. Before iMessage, before WhatsApp, before Telegram, BBM allowed users to communicate via data channels, bypassing expensive SMS plans entirely. In emerging markets, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, the Middle East, BBM became a cultural phenomenon entirely separate from its corporate identity. Indonesian teenagers were buying Blackberries specifically to use BBM when no Western consumer brand had even acknowledged those markets existed. Third detail. The US federal government's dependence on BlackBerry was so deep that as late as 2013, 2 years after BlackBerry's market share had already collapsed, the State Department still had 70,000 BlackBerry devices in circulation that it could not legally retire. The government procurement and security certification cycle is so slow that even after the private sector had largely moved on, the federal government was locked in. That institutional inertia is the direct ancestor of the QNX monopoly we will discuss later. The moment the empire was already dead and nobody knew. Here is the moment that changes everything you just heard. On January 9th, 2007, the day Steve Jobs walked onto that stage at Macworld and unveiled the iPhone, Mike Lazaridis was watching on a screen in Waterloo. According to documented accounts from multiple former RIM executives, his reaction was not fear, it was dismissal. He turned to the engineers around him and said, and this is documented, this is an impossibility. The networks would never be able to carry this. He was not wrong about the technical challenge. Early iPhones did crush AT&T's 3G network, but he was catastrophically wrong about what that meant. He believed the bandwidth problem would kill the device. He did not understand that consumers would simply tolerate a slower network in exchange for a superior experience. He evaluated the iPhone as an engineer evaluating a network load, not as a human being evaluating joy. And that single intellectual miscalculation, that beautiful, logical engineering mistake, set the company on a death spiral that would cost shareholders over $80 billion in value over the next 8 years. But the reason the company survived, the reason it is still standing in 2026 with 275 million cars running its software, is buried in something Lazaridis did 2 years earlier that nobody paid attention to at the time. In 2010, RIM acquired a small software company called QNX. The price was $200 million, a rounding error compared to the $83 billion market cap. Most analysts dismissed it as a minor product enhancement for the upcoming BlackBerry smartphone platform. They were wrong because QNX was not a phone operating system. It was a safety critical microkernel RTOS, the kind that runs nuclear power plants, air traffic control systems, and medical devices. It was the most resilient, most precise, most rigorously certified operating system ever built for industrial embedded systems. And Lazaridis, even as his consumer business was already dying, had quietly placed a $200 million bet on the industrial Internet of Things that nobody in the press would talk about for another decade. Now, about that email trail. The options backdating fraud. For 10 consecutive years, from 1996 to 2006, the senior leadership at Research in Motion engaged in a systematic, illegal scheme to backdate stock options. And they had an internal email chain that proved they knew exactly what they were doing. Here is how backdating works. When a company grants stock options, the strike price, the price at which the executive can buy shares, is supposed to be set at the current market price on the day of the grant. That is the law. Backdating means you look backwards through the calendar, find a day when the stock price was lower, and pretend the grant was made on that date. The executive can then immediately exercise the option at the artificially low strike price and pocket the difference, risk-free, while the shareholders who actually bought stock at market price absorb the dilution. According to SEC complaint number 20902, this was not an accounting error at RIM. It was a coordinated scheme. CFO Dennis Kavelman and VP of Finance Angelo Loberto would review historical stock charts, identify the lowest point in a given quarter, and backdate the grants to that date. The executives generated an improper gain of approximately $53.65 million. But here is what makes it remarkable. They knew. On one documented occasion, Kavelman explicitly instructed a manager in a written email, and this is a direct documented finding from the SEC, not to document the pricing methodology. His exact instruction was that it was a major breach of protocol to be discussing and documenting via email using option pricing other than that allowable by the Ontario Securities Commission and the SEC. He put the instruction not to leave a paper trail in an email. And then, in July 2006, while the internal audit was already raising flags, while the SEC was already looking, Kavelman walked into the annual shareholder meeting and flatly denied in front of the entire investor community that RIM was backdating options. The final cost. The OSC levied a settlement of 76.85 million Canadian dollars. The SEC extracted fines totaling over 1.4 million US dollars from the 4 executives. Balsillie personally paid 5 million Canadian dollars, the largest securities fine against an individual in Canadian history at that time. The company spent an additional $45 million just on the internal investigation. So, why did no one go to prison? The answer is structural. The SEC and OSC built a prosecutorial case around civil securities fraud, the kind that ends in settlement agreements rather than handcuffs. Criminal fraud charges require proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt. The executives agreed to massive settlements that included no admission of wrongdoing. Balsillie was forced to resign as chairman but remained co-CEO. He continued running the company for 3 more years. The board, which was supposed to represent shareholders, let it happen. The dual CEO paralysis, the governance disaster nobody fixed. For 2 decades, Research in Motion was run by 2 co-CEOs who also served as co-chairmen of the board. Lazaridis controlled engineering, Balsillie controlled sales and finance. They supervised themselves. Their independent directors were described by institutional investors as bean counters, accountants, economists, and legacy finance figures with zero experience in mobile technology. By 2010, when the iPhone and Android were visibly destroying their market share, the two men had stopped communicating effectively. Lazaridis wanted to preserve the physical keyboard. Balsillie wanted to license BlackBerry Messenger to rival handset makers, which would have made the company an early WhatsApp and potentially saved it. Because neither man had supreme authority, every major strategic decision became a political negotiation between two founding egos. Decisions that should have taken weeks took years. But the board did not act. And the reason the board did not act reveals something fundamental about how corporate governance fails in practice. Balsillie and Lazaridis collectively owned roughly 10% of the outstanding shares. They wielded enormous cultural authority as the founders. The independent directors were local Waterloo area allies who had been on the board for years. When institutional investors demanded leadership accountability, the board's lead director, John Richardson, repeatedly defended the co-CEO structure publicly, even as the stock fell 75% in 3 years. It took a financial crisis and external activist pressure from investors like Jaguar Financial, who called for the founders' ouster publicly in 2011 to finally break the paralysis. The Z10 inventory fraud, the deception that cost $934 million. When Balsillie and Lazaridis finally stepped down as co-CEOs in January 2012, the board replaced them with an internal COO named Thorsten Heinz. His first public statement about the company's strategic direction was, "I don't think there is a drastic change needed." The market responded by dropping the stock another 5% in a single trading session. Heinz's singular bet was a new operating system, BlackBerry 10, built on the QNX platform RIM had acquired in 2010. The flagship device was the Z10 touchscreen smartphone, launched in early 2013. And internally, from the moment it launched, the sales data was catastrophic. Customers were buying the Z10, discovering that the new operating system had almost no third-party apps, and returning the devices to carriers. The return rates were, by multiple accounts, astronomical. Carriers were quietly begging BlackBerry to take the inventory back. Heinz knew. His CFO, Brian Bidulka, knew. Throughout the spring and summer of 2013, they continued making public statements that the BB10 transition was progressing on its financial and operational commitments. Those were the exact words used publicly. In September 2013, the company announced a $934 million write-down for unsold Z10 inventory. Simultaneously, they announced the termination of 4,500 employees, 40% of the entire workforce. The stock dropped 25% in a single day. Shareholders filed a class action federal lawsuit under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, alleging materially false statements about BB10 demand. In 2022, 9 years later, BlackBerry settled for $165 million in cash, specifically to avoid a trial where internal communications would have been made public. The encryption betrayal, what they sold and what it cost. Here is the moment where the company's core marketing claim, total privacy, unbreakable security, ran directly into the financial reality of operating in authoritarian markets. In 2010, the governments of India, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia issued a coordinated ultimatum to RIM: provide domestic access to BlackBerry consumer message traffic or face a total ban on BlackBerry services. RIM's official public position was that this was impossible, that the encryption was end-to-end, that the keys were held by enterprise customers, not by RIM, that no backdoor existed. That was true for corporate clients on the enterprise BES network. It was not true for retail consumers using the public BlackBerry Internet Service (BIS) network. BIS traffic flowed through RIM's own network operation centers. RIM did hold the keys. Rather than lose access to these growing markets, RIM capitulated. They set up localized servers in India. They provided consumer message access to Saudi and Emirati state security services. They protected their quarterly revenue at the direct expense of the personal privacy of millions of retail users, people who had purchased a BlackBerry specifically because they believed the company's security promises were unconditional. The press covered it briefly. The company issued careful, technically accurate denials about the enterprise network. The story faded. Because the financial press in 2011 was far more interested in the iPhone's rising market share numbers than in a nuanced story about consumer data sovereignty. Which brings us to the single most expensive decision in BlackBerry's post-smartphone history. A decision that destroyed $1.24 billion in shareholder capital and was deliberately obscured across 4 quarterly reports so that no single number would be large enough to trigger a front page story. This is the Cylance catastrophe, and it is the reason the question of what BlackBerry is actually worth today is far more complicated than the stock price suggests. The Cylance catastrophe, $1.4 billion in, $160 million out. In November 2018, BlackBerry, now under CEO John Chen, announced the acquisition of Cylance for $1.4 billion in cash. It was the largest acquisition in the company's history. It was positioned as the defining move of the new BlackBerry, a software-first, AI-native cybersecurity company that would compete directly with CrowdStrike and SentinelOne. By fiscal year 2025, Cylance was generating a $51 million operating loss per year. The cybersecurity division had gone from being the company's stated future to being the most dangerous weight on its balance sheet. In December 2024, BlackBerry quietly signed a definitive agreement to sell Cylance to Arctic Wolf for $160 million. $80 million in cash at close, $40 million deferred, and 5.5 million shares in Arctic Wolf. The arithmetic is straightforward. 1.4 billion paid, 160 million received. $1.24 billion of shareholder capital destroyed in 6 years. Beginning in fiscal 2022, BlackBerry started phasing the Cylance goodwill write-downs, the accounting recognition that an asset is worth less than you paid for it, across multiple quarters. Rather than taking one catastrophic write-down in a single quarter, the company spread the impairment charges gradually. Only when assembled across the full timeline does the true magnitude of the destruction become visible. The Prem Vatsa shadow, the debt holder at the board table. There is a governance dynamic in BlackBerry's recent history that receives almost no coverage in the financial press. Prem Vatsa, founder of Fairfax Financial Holdings and BlackBerry's largest individual shareholder, is also BlackBerry's lead director on the board. Vatsa, as lead director, was simultaneously sitting at the board table, the fiduciary responsible for overseeing management on behalf of all shareholders, while also being the primary debt holder collecting interest payments from the company his board seat was supposed to govern. This arrangement is legal, but the conflict of interest it creates is why institutional investors have applied a structural discount to BlackBerry stock. They view the company, at least in part, as a captive asset within Prem Vatsa's broader portfolio, rather than an independently governed public company whose board makes decisions solely in the interest of all shareholders. The FDA cybersecurity vulnerability, the QNX problem nobody wants to talk about. In 2021, the US Food and Drug Administration issued a cybersecurity advisory specifically warning about vulnerabilities in legacy versions of BlackBerry's QNX operating system embedded in medical devices. The advisory documented that certain versions of QNX contain stack-based buffer overflow vulnerabilities that could allow a malicious actor to execute arbitrary code on affected devices. Devices like patient monitors, hospital infusion pumps, and surgical equipment. This was not a theoretical risk. It was a documented cybersecurity exposure in safety-critical medical infrastructure. But it exposed a structural tension. The same feature that makes QNX so valuable, its ubiquity, its deep integration into long lifecycle hardware, also means that when vulnerabilities are found, they exist in devices that cannot be quickly updated. A car lasts 12 years. A medical device lasts 15. A software vulnerability in infrastructure that cannot be rapidly patched is not a software problem. It is an infrastructure problem. And as QNX continues to expand into autonomous vehicles, industrial robotics, and surgical systems, the stakes of that vulnerability profile only increase. 3 things BlackBerry does brilliantly. First, the QNX certification moat is genuinely irreplicable on a short timeline. ISO 26262 ASILD certification, the highest functional safety standard for automotive software, requires years of rigorous code auditing, documentation, and regulatory validation. No startup can accelerate through it. No open source project can achieve it quickly because the audit process requires a closed, controlled code base that can be verified line by line. This is not a temporary competitive advantage. It is a structural barrier that protects QNX from rapid disruption for a minimum of 5 to 7 years, the length of an automotive development cycle, regardless of what competitors build. Second, the government and defense sticky base is among the most durable revenue foundations in the enterprise software industry. FedRAMP Class D High certification, NATO communications infrastructure, SecuSuite for encrypted voice, ad hoc crisis communications embedded in 80% of US federal agencies. These contracts do not churn annually. They renew for multi-year cycles and are governed by procurement bureaucracies that are institutionally resistant to change. A competitor offering marginally better features or marginally lower pricing does not displace a FedRAMP certified government vendor. The switching cost is not financial. It is regulatory, operational, and political. Third, the capital discipline under CEO John Giammatteo, appointed in late 2023, has been exceptional under the circumstances. Selling Cylance at a massive loss was painful. Slashing $150 million in operating expenses was painful, but the result is documented. By fiscal year 2026, BlackBerry posted a full-year GAAP net income of $53.2 million, the first genuine profitability in years, and $432 million in cash and investments on the balance sheet. The company stopped the bleeding. That required making decisions that politically were almost impossible for the executives who had championed Cylance's acquisition to make. Giammatteo made them anyway. Three structural problems, precisely stated. First, the dollar-based net retention rate in the Secure Communications division is 94%. Management has described this metric as improving, up 1 percentage point year over year. But the baseline is alarming. A 94% DBNRR means that if BlackBerry stopped acquiring new customers today, its existing revenue base would shrink by 6% every single year from churn and downgrades alone. Elite software companies, Snowflake, Datadog, CrowdStrike, report DBNRR between 115% and 130%, meaning existing customers are consistently expanding their usage and spending more over time. BlackBerry is running a leaky bucket and describing the leak as an improvement. Second, the royalty backlog of $950 million in QNX, which management presents as forward revenue visibility, is a projection, not a guarantee. It is calculated based on estimated vehicle production volumes multiplied by per vehicle royalty rates. If global automobile production contracts significantly due to a recession, a geopolitical disruption, or an accelerated shift toward vertically integrated EV software stacks led by companies like Tesla that build their own operating systems, that backlog will require impairment. The number on the page is compelling. The assumptions underneath it carry more risk than the Investor Day presentations acknowledge. Third, the valuation structure is a trap. As of mid-2026, BlackBerry's stock is trading at approximately 114 times earnings. That is an extraordinarily expensive multiple for a company growing total revenues at 3% annually. The QNX division deserves a high growth multiple. The Secure Communications division deserves a slow growth government contract multiple. Bundled together under a single ticker, institutional investors cannot accurately price either. Growth-focused funds will not buy because the Secure Communications segment drags down top-line growth metrics. Value funds will not buy because the QNX segment makes the PE ratio look irrational. The result is a perpetual valuation discount, a conglomerate penalty that leaves the company chronically undervalued relative to its parts and chronically overvalued relative to its blended growth rate. 3 realistic solutions. Solution 1. complete the separation. The operational division between IoT and secure communications already exists. BlackBerry needs to finish the job and trade as two separate equities. QNX, as a pure play physical AI and automotive safety software company, would command a completely different institutional investor base and a completely different multiple, potentially one that reflects the 34% compound growth rate management has projected for that division. Secure Communications, as a standalone government and defense software vendor, would attract specialized buyers who understand the stability and cash generation of regulated sector recurring revenue. Every day, these two businesses share a stock ticker. Value is being destroyed. Solution 2. Build the IVY data platform into a third-party developer ecosystem with urgency. BlackBerry IVY, the vehicle data platform built with AWS, has been in development for years. The theoretical market is immense. Modern vehicles generate terabytes of data about driver behavior, component performance, and road conditions. IVY processes that data at the edge and routes actionable insights to the cloud. But the platform only generates meaningful recurring revenue if OEMs activate it in production vehicles and if third-party developers build applications on top of it. The platform needs an aggressive incentive structure to overcome OEM hesitation about data monetization agreements with a third party. The window to establish IVY as the industry standard is finite. Android Automotive and Azure IoT are not standing still. Solution 3. Recruit board-level AI and robotics expertise before the next technology cycle arrives. The NVIDIA integration with QNX SDP 8.0 is the most important strategic development in BlackBerry's recent history. It positions QNX as the safety-critical operating layer for physical AI, autonomous vehicles, surgical robots, industrial automation. But navigating this space requires board-level understanding of silicon roadmaps, AI development cycles, and robotics procurement. The current board is excellent at governance and enterprise software. It is not equipped to pressure test management's claims about the physical AI opportunity at a technical level. That gap is a risk. The framework. How to evaluate any company with a legacy brand. Here is what the BlackBerry story actually teaches, and it applies to every corporate empire you will ever evaluate. The most dangerous moment in a company's history is not the crisis, it is the decade before the crisis, when success feels permanent. Research in Motion was not destroyed by Apple. It was destroyed by 10 consecutive years of unchallenged dominance that convinced the founders the rules that governed other companies did not apply to them. The options backdating ran for a decade before regulators closed in. The governance vacuum ran for 2 decades before institutional investors forced a change. The strategic denial about touchscreens lasted 3 years after the iPhone proved the premise wrong beyond any reasonable doubt. The pattern is always the same. Call it the dominance trap. When a company controls a market so completely that competition feels theoretical, the internal culture stops stress testing its own assumptions. The board stops asking hard questions because the stock is up. The executives stop listening to the engineers because last quarter was record revenue. The PR team stops managing crises because there haven't been any. And then, in a compressed, violent, often irreversible window, everything that was true stops being true. The market shifts, the technology changes, the consumer moves on, and the leadership team, operating from a mental model built in the previous era, responds to a 21st century problem with a 20th century playbook. What separates BlackBerry from most companies that fall into this trap is that buried underneath 20 years of arrogance and mismanagement, one team of engineers in Waterloo quietly kept building something that the market could not live without. They just built it for cars instead of people. Whether the current leadership has the commercial execution discipline to convert that engineering achievement into the next decade of shareholder value, that is the open question. BlackBerry's story is a precise study in what happens when institutional arrogance, governance failure, and engineering excellence exist inside the same company simultaneously. The arrogance hollowed out the consumer empire. The governance failures cost shareholders over $1 billion in destruction they were never clearly told about. And the engineering excellence, patient, unglamorous, and almost entirely invisible, quietly built a software monopoly in the most important hardware category of the next 2 decades. The company that the world considers dead is running the car you drove to work today. The question is whether the people currently running it deserve the second chance the engineers earned. Next week, Strategy Lens investigates Ticketmaster. Here is what we are going to show you. Ticketmaster controls between 70% and 80% of the primary ticketing market for major live events in the United States. In 2023, a congressional hearing established that the company's parent, Live Nation Entertainment, has used its vertical integration across venues, ticketing, and artist management to extract fees that in documented cases add more than 75% to the face value of a ticket. But here is the question you probably haven't thought about. The antitrust lawsuit the Department of Justice filed against Live Nation in 2024, if it succeeds, does not actually guarantee that ticket prices go down. The reason for that is buried in how the revenue split between artists, venues, and platforms actually works. And when you see how that split is structured, you will understand why breaking up Ticketmaster is far more complicated than the politicians suggesting it have acknowledged publicly. What does a Ticketmaster breakup actually mean for the economics of live music? We will show you the numbers that the DOJ hearing did not cover. Subscribe so you do not miss it. The last people to understand that an empire was dying were always the ones inside it. The last people to understand that a new one was being born were everyone else.